Welcome everyone to Massey College and a Massey College Dialogue. My name is Jonathan Rose. I'm the acting principal here at Massey College, and I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous peoples have lived. It is on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We are grateful, we want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship towards the land and the great privilege we have to work on this land. And I'm delighted to point out that Guima Stacey Laforme, the former chief of the Mississaugas, is right here with us and is keen to engage in this discussion. And I'm also delighted to report that we're blessed with the presence of Her Honor, the Lieutenant Governor, Edith Dumont. This dialogue has a little history that I had a small part in. All of us have been living in a world in which we're worried about how we're all talking to each other. And I made a few comments about that in a Massey newsletter that some of you might have received. And two people, Carolyn Toohey and Paul Gooch, responded and said, you know, we've been writing about that. And if you like, I can send you the pieces they wrote in different venues exactly on this topic. And that caused Carolyn and myself to have lunch. We sat together with junior fellow Robbie Steele, I don't know if he's here, and Matt Glanfield, and that ended up in Carolyn agreeing to run this event. And so I'm very, very grateful that you've chosen to do that. I think this topic is more important, and I've really enjoyed listening to Randy Boyagoda talk about this topic in the Massey Risk Committee, and I've had a good look at Ian Williams' brand new book. Ian Williams is he is this year's CBC Massey lecturer, and as you know, that comes along with the duty and wonderful output of this book, What I Mean to Say, by Ian Williams, Remaking Conversation in Our Time, exactly on the topic we're going to go at today, and I'm sure in the wonderful lectures to come. So let me introduce who's going to organize this to you, which is Carolyn Toohey. She is a highly regarded scholar and in comparative public policy and social policy. She has authored numerous journal articles, 8 books on social policy, including patterns of policy change, medical politics, professional self-regulation, long-term care, regulation of occupational health hazards, and comparative approaches in public policy. Her most recent book is Remaking Policy, Scale, Pace, and Political Strategy in Healthcare Reform, and she's currently working on a book on the power of narrative discourse in public policy, really on point here today. She has had many senior roles, including Deputy Provost and Vice President Government and Institutional Relations, and is the sponsor behind the Carolyn Toohey Impact on Public Policy Award that is awarded here every year at the University of Toronto. So please welcome Carolyn Toohey.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for those generous words. And it is a real pleasure to see this event come about, it having been just a germ of an idea a few months ago on such an important topic and with such outstanding speakers. Let me say just a few words about the title, Civic Discourse and Liberal Democracy. So let's start with liberal democracy. At its essence, democracy is governance with the consent of the governed. There are numerous institutional means for building and registering that consent, but as one of the leading theorists of democracy, and my former professor, Robert Dahl, classically observed, democracy is an ideal which real-life political systems only approximate to various degrees. So we can not so much talk about whether a system is a democracy or not, but how democratic it is, what level of democratization has it reached, and he and other scholars have offered various criteria by which we judge the level of democratization. And those apply, and this is important in this context, not only to the institutions of government, like accountable executives and legislatures and independent judiciaries, but also to institutions of civil society, institutions that sit outside the state, but are nonetheless key to ensuring that the consent of the governed, by ensuring that the people have the information, education, well-being, and social connections necessary to form, test, and register their views, that the consent of the governed is truly legitimate. Chief among these civil society institutions are the media, the universities, the professions, and the multiple agencies that make up what we now call the third sector. What makes a democracy liberal in both state and society is its granting of rights to its citizens, most centrally rights to freedom of expression and association in civil society, to participation in the institutions of government, and to equality before the law. And those rights, of course, may come into conflict. There are inherent tensions among them. But all of those criteria imply a fundamental precondition, namely that there is a broad public acceptance of the inherent pluralism of liberal democracy. There must, in other words, be both support for the flourishing of multiple institutions and avenues of participation in both state and society, and respect for the rights of others, as well as oneself, to choose among these various options. Only if consent has been tested through the clash and the confluence of these multiple sites of debate can it be said to approximate the democratic ideal. Which brings us to the other half of the title for today's event, Civil Discourse. Civil discourse is discourse that is constitutive of civil society, discourse that encourages the emergence of a common ground of mutual respect in which multiple institutions can be rooted. And it is that aspect of liberal democracy which seems currently under a growing threat. Is liberal democratic consent possible in a context in which discourse is deeply polarized into mutually exclusive and hostile camps, in which social media coarsen our exchanges and public expressions are marked by what one columnist characterized, and I paraphrase, as the call and response high of in-group solidarity? How do we learn to talk to one another in settings more diverse than the architects of liberal democracy ever experienced? So today's event brings us together to consider two central questions. What are the conditions for civil discourse? And what are the roles and responsibilities of institutions of civil society, including the university, for fostering and ensuring those conditions? And I could not be more thrilled about the quality of the discussants that we have assembled for this discussion. They are deeply thoughtful colleagues who care profoundly about these issues and are centrally addressing them in their work. We begin with a conversation between Ian Williams and Randy Boyagoda. Both are professors of English at U of T, perhaps not coincidentally, given the centrality of language in constituting liberal democracy. Ian, as the principal has just noted, is this year's CBC Massey Lecturer on the topic of remaking conversation for our time. Randy is leading a consultation on civil discourse in the university as the provost advisor on these matters. And their conversation will be moderated by Massey Junior Fellow Satayesh Yazdani, whose contributions to Massey as a unique institution of civil society, and I think we should be proud of that, a unique institution of civil society, were recognized last year with the award of the Aubie and Esther Rose Angel Scholarship in Leadership. The conversation will be followed by a stellar panel to offer reflections and other perspectives, chaired by Professor Paul Gooch, a philosopher par excellence and institutional citizen of the highest rank. I will say a few more words about Paul when I introduce him later, and then he in turn will introduce the panelists. But for now, let me welcome Satayesh and Ian and Randy and turn the floor over to them. Thank you.
just want to do a test mic to make sure all of them work. Perfect. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction, Carolyn. I've prepared some questions, but I'm pretty sure that the conversation is going to be very natural. So, Carolyn a little talked about why we invited you, but I just want to, for our audience hearing about your background and what is your involvement in civil discourse?
Like how far back do you want to go? I think sort of, if you want to get like way, way back, I started U of T as a student in psychology and English because I thought people and communication were really important to me. And that's sort of evolved over different phases of my career over time. But like in middle age here, to return to it like fully, those original motivations for the things I considered like supremely important in terms of like organizing a life and deciding how I wanted to live and what were important to me. And then there are a bunch of like social things, right? Like all these declines that happened that returned me to that original kind of thought. It never quite left me. So I think partly sort of the hostility online on social media, there's a political situation. All of these things sort of like encroached on my my comfort, right? And then kind of forced me to return to some of my original motivations. Yeah.
If Ian starts at university, I have to somehow best Ian, so I'll go to 1980s Oshawa in terms of the origin story of my own investment in civil discourse. Only now do I see it in these terms. But growing up in 1980s Oshawa as the oldest child of Sri Lankan immigrants, whenever the phone rang, I would answer it because I would speak to the Canadians. And I was the translator and the mediator between whoever was on the phone or whoever came to the front door and my parents, who speak English fine, but I was, from the youngest possible age, the one who was always going in between. And I think that probably cultivated, to some degree, my interest in sustaining conversations, which seems to me core to the question of civil discourse. If we jump ahead, I'll jump ahead to two things. Professor Brian Corman is here with us. Brian Corman, longtime chair of the English department, university administrator. When I was an undergraduate here, I was at a dinner at Trinity College, and he knew at the time that I was working on an independent study on William Faulkner. And he said to me, "How's Faulkner treating you?" And I had this moment where I thought, no, but that's from a course. Why are you asking me about this outside a course? And then I realized that the life of the mind extends beyond courses, beyond classes. But in order to sustain a life of the mind beyond going to school, beyond answering a front door, you have to be willing and able to have conversation that extends beyond what you were presuming or expecting a conversation is supposed to be about. That, and then I would say my life here as university administrator and then leading into this job in civil discourse that I have now.
All right. Thank you both for that introduction. That's great. So I'm glad that you opened up the core aspects of the discussion. If you were to describe what are the fundamental elements of civil discourse, and in your opinion, what would it be? And we'll start with you, Ian.
Yeah, a few things. Freedom, absolutely, right? There's freedom, which involves tolerance, and the ability to let go of your position as well. So I think we think about the point of a kind of discussion or negotiation is to persuade someone over to your side, right, to win them over. But a really healthy conversation is not one that aims to conclude immediately, right? I think we want to win too quickly, and so the conversations never quite get rolling. So to be able to live in a kind of space of like in-betweenness and a space that's not quite resolved yet, and probably like maybe indefinitely, maybe your entire lifetime, you never quite get that issue resolved. So to be comfortable without winning, without resolving something, and with being not just sort of promoting your own freedom to speak, but allowing the other person their freedom too, right? And their freedom can conflict with yours, and you can both kind of coexist. There are a bunch of contradictions and tensions that require a kind of like sophisticated being in the world, right? It's not like we can't be like playground kids that I feel like we're kind of reverting to an earlier form of we have to mature to have these kinds of, to have good conversations.
Let me build on what Ian said in two directions. My working phrase for civil discourse is a willingness and a commitment to think out loud together. Think out loud together. Those are, for me, the key words for what civil discourse means. What sustains that? I would say two things. One would be curiosity, a genuine interest in something from someone else, from somewhere else, that doesn't simply cohere and correspond to what you already think. And then second, and I think this is probably, to my mind, foundational, and it's what we have to recover to create the kind of mature conversation Ian was just describing, is epistemic humility. This is a term that Michael Spence, I know, that's like an $8 term, but epistemic humility is a term developed by Michael Spence, who is the president of University College London. He's a legal scholar. And he describes epistemic humility as a willingness to recognize and reckon with the fact that you don't know everything, and therefore, from a position of humility, you seek to learn more. So humility and curiosity together are, for my money, preconditions for civil discourse.
Perfect. So what I gathered from both of you is a couple things. You think that freedom is really important, right? And being okay with the discomfort of not winning an argument. Absolutely. It's not about that.
Right.
And you think that there are two fundamental things. One is curiosity, and the second one being the humility, right? But how, as a society, the members can get there?
Yeah, I'm skeptical about your freedom idea. I want to push you on that.
Yeah, I think this sort of follow-up there, sort of combining these things, is that there also has to be a space that's free of consequence, right? If you really want to be curious, and if you really feel free to be humble, and you want to think aloud with people who may disagree with you, then you should be free not to be punished for making a mistake in that kind of space, right? So a kind of, when I say openness, I mean broadly between people, the conversationalists, and also between the audience and the speakers. So, I mean, not to be hasty to punish folks. I think that's critical to freedom.
I would say that, before Elon Musk weaponized the term, I think an absolute commitment to freedom of speech, short of violence, makes sense. And no one in this room, I'm going to guess, is going to disagree with that. I was a former president of Penn Canada. There's another Charlie Foran in the corner over there. Our commitment as a literary organization is to defend writers in peril, celebrate literature, and defend freedom of expression. But what happens, and we would all agree that incitement to violence is a clear stop, a clear barrier. But we now live in an age where there can be metaphoric understandings of violence, that you are doing a violence to my person with your ideas and your freedom to speak them. I think this is where things get messy. We all agree to this concept, but what if I feel unsafe? What if I feel dehumanized by your freedom to think out loud about something? Who and how do we then determine what it means to keep the conversation going?
Yeah, this is the really thorny thing, right, that you're identifying. And I think the distinction there is between safety and comfort, right? And we sort of conflate the two as if my discomfort is somehow life-threatening, right? It can feel that way sometimes when the anxiety, when you're sort of in the space of a panic attack or something, it can really feel like near death. But more and more to sort of make these gradations clear, and they're kind of personal. There's personal work that needs to be done here. There's no one solution for, like, here's the word that we cannot utter in public because it's damaging. But within each of us, there's a kind of capacity that we can expand over time if we are, like, truly sensitive, I think, to that difference between safety and comfort. Safe space has been so another one of those terms that's been really sort of like weaponized and devalued. But it's okay to be uncomfortable. Every time we exercise, I ran here from the subway. It was very uncomfortable. Didn't kill me. It might have actually been very good for me long term, right? And so to embrace that kind of like discomfort ultimately can build those kinds of internal muscles. I mean, like emotional and sort of intellectual muscles that we need to relate to each other.
Okay. So there's a lot of work that one person has to do, right? But at the same time, I'm a student in an institution, so that's the person's job to be okay with that discomfort, and there's some personal work at that level. Sorry, I should be using the mic. But then the question becomes how institutions are responsible. You're both professors, work with students every day.
Sure.
So you see them engaging in conversations. What is the responsibility of institutions?
I wish I saw them engaging in more conversations. I wish I saw them engaging in more arguments that were good arguments. The institution's role, Carolyn brought this up even in her opening kind of reflection on the role of the university in all of this. The university is at odds with itself. We want you to come here and be challenged and think hard thoughts and develop yourself in all these different ways and do it in the most safe way possible. These two things cannot be true. One of these has to take a priority, and I think the challenge of institutions right now, especially universities, is that not enough of us, I think, are reckoning with the fact that you can't have it both ways. And that doesn't mean not every single event has to completely damn one or the other, but I think it's a more honest reckoning with, this is gonna be an event that's gonna go this way. It's gonna be tough, and here's how we're gonna do it. This is not an event or a topic where we're gonna go there yet. And the challenge, I'll say specifically, because I know we're here at the University of Toronto, is that we're not the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago is famous for being a place where students are told, you're gonna come here and you're not going to be safe. You're gonna be challenged, you're gonna be pushed. Welcome to the University of Chicago, that's what it means. That's not the University of Toronto, and I'm not saying this critically, I'm saying this neutrally. The University of Toronto has a different mission, a different character, a different role. Welcome to the University of Toronto. We have a committee on civil discourse. You know, so I think it's balancing these things.
But this is the place where we learn to be citizens too, right? So
Absolutely.
I think your kid goes to kindergarten and they get in a fight over like the color of her hair or something, and their maturity level, they have to duke it out at a kindergarten level, right, about sort of differences and whatnot. You come to university, and this is like that step between, your high school concerns and being a responsible citizen in the world. And I think something in this space here has to be even wilder than the world, right? This is maybe the safety. So that we learn how to negotiate big gaps of ideological difference and do it with people who are intelligent, who know the history, who can sort of like say, that method is good, that method is not good. Here's what they did in the 1960s. You've got all of those resources here to sort of inform your participation when you leave here. And I'm not sure that sort of like overvaluing safety, right? Overvaluing protection. And this is not just a university, it's a sort of cultural moment, right? Of like helicoptering and all of that. I don't think that does a great service ultimately to build resilient citizens.
If I could, what Ian is just describing to me reminds me of a crucial event that I can recall from when I was an undergraduate here. And it was a late night debate in a residence room with a student who had been studying Peter Singer in a philosophy course. Peter Singer, the philosopher who has a kind of a radically non-hierarchical view of animal life, does not privilege humans per se. And this conversation went on at length into the night with pizza. And it got to a point where one of the people I was arguing with was arguing for bestiality. I'm not kidding. Now, I don't think they were endorsing it from an autobiographical vantage, but they were carrying out some of the implications of Peter Singer's ideas to one logical end, which is to say, bestiality. And we're arguing this in a real way late at night. I am deeply skeptical that would happen in a residence room in 2024. Because either they're staring at their phones or they're filming someone talk about how they want to have sex with a cow, right? Either way, do you see what I mean? The intervening presence of this technology, atomizing people or performing things and then reporting on people, both of these things, I think, interrupt the kind of good collective thinking that you can do at university. In the wild, like I thought about it when Ian, you mentioned it being wild. That is a wild experience to have had in retrospect, but it worked, you know?
Yeah, now I'm wondering, is all conversation profitable, right? Do we need to have conversations about that in particular? Are some things just kind of better left like unexplored, you know, even conversationally? But I think I would prefer to err, at least when you're, you know,
Randy Boygo defends bestiality at Massey College. That'll be the tweet. Okay, go on.
Already a meme right now, right? You don't know it. But yeah, but if there's any place to have these conversations, it's here, right? The conversation that probably shouldn't be had. It's here. It's in a classroom. It's with your friends in a dorm. And then you can sort of work it out in your system and sort of move on to other kinds of things afterwards.
So you started talking about cultural safety, and there was that back and forth. And I mean, I'm a student, so I have lived experience on campus.
What do you study?
I study Doctors of Pharmacy.
Got it.
4th year, yes. And a few of my professors are here, actually, so that's great. So when it comes to cultural safety, I think we're so aware as a generation, like all of us students, to be very careful in conversations. So if you're always very careful of what you're saying, you don't want to sound offensive, because the moment you say something, everybody's going to be like, this is offensive. Then how do you walk that? What are the boundaries, right? As someone who wants to engage in civil discourse, how do you go about that? This is the challenge of a student, really.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's troubling, right? Because there's almost like no access to a real person, right? Because there are all these kinds of screens and walls and defenses that are ready to turn you into some kind of agent for social standing, right? So what Randy's saying about being recorded, or they're waiting for you to say that offensive thing so that victimization can be like mobilized or whatever. Like that's the worst kind of, that's me being like somewhat cynical about it, right? Because I think there are people with lived experiences who are genuinely hurt and traumatized by certain subjects and areas, and we should be sensitive with that.
Can I jump in on that,
Yeah,
Ian?
I'm still thinking, sure.
In a real-time way. Just before the session started, I was chatting with my colleague Dale Turner over there about the challenge of Indigenous hiring in STEM. And we were chatting, we were going back and forth, and we were talking about Canadian versus global patterns. And then I said, well, what about if it was a Native American? That's what I said. And Dale said, well, actually, that's not the term we use. And we kept on going in our conversation. Dale assigned the best of intentions to my using a wrong term. And we kept on going. Why? Because the subject matter and the fact that we have a relationship. We know each other. He knows that the idea that I'm getting at is an idea that we're trying to work out together, and he didn't stop the conversation or in a passive way go, and then keep on going. So I hear you about the dramatic ways that it's hard for people to have conversations, but what I worry about, and I imagine every single person in this room has experiences with this, are the small erosions for fear of getting it wrong. So you just sand it off a little bit. You step back a little bit. You don't keep on going. I just used the wrong term for an Indigenous person with my Indigenous colleague. I will never speak about this again. If he had responded differently, right, would be the worry. But we all have these problems unless you assign the best of intentions to someone, unless you realize we're actually thinking out loud about something together. You're going to make a mistake, as you were saying earlier. You can make a mistake. We need to be more forgiving, I think.
Not be penalized.
Yes, exactly.
You're allowed to make mistakes,
Yes.
and you're being understood.
As long as you, okay, what's the intention? What's the larger story here? What's really happening as opposed to?
I think I can go back to the core principles too here, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can make mistake, but then you want to be sensitive. So it's tricky, I find.
Yeah, where I'm stuck is like, how do we elicit this kind of generosity from the person we're speaking to, right? We might want to sort of bestow this. We might say, oh, they made a mistake, it's just a joke or whatever. And I think racialized people are used to sort of giving folks a pass on these things, right? Because we're always like doubled, right? We're like, okay, they didn't intend that, but it sort of still bugged me. I can put my feelings aside for a moment and sort of understand what they're saying. But yeah, I'm trying to figure out a way where it doesn't cost the person speaking or the person whom you're offending anything, and we can still elicit that kindness from them. And one thing is that humility. It's hard to sort of trounce on like a humble person, right? You don't want to attack somebody who is honestly like deferential and saying like, I'm just trying my best here, right? Don't hurt me. You'd be a monster to hurt that person, right? There are monsters, they exist. So there's one way, but yeah, I think we need more kinds of tools for not eliciting the position from the person we're speaking to, but eliciting the attitude that we want to sort of have that conversation with, right?
What I would call the disposition. The disposition.
It's like an English prof moment. That's a better word than what I was thinking.
All right,
Yeah.
I want to take a pivot to this question because there's a second part to the title of the panel, right? So all of this civil discourse in a Canadian context, in our current society, how do you see it? What's the state of civil discourse in Canada? You can even focus on, you know, our city, Toronto, but really just give us a glimpse of what you think it's currently at.
Thinking about it. Yeah, I mean, I will see like firsthand. I'm thinking about it. I think there's a kind of, you know, just like how accents are getting kind of flattened because of like the sort of ubiquity of media and like sort of a dominant kind of way of talking. I think our sort of political atmosphere gets really contaminated by the tone set by the Americans, right? And so I expect to see, and let's see what happens as we sort of move into our own election cycle. I expect to see sort of like base rhetoric. I expect to see really divided camps. I expected to see like a conservative and liberal sort of division around a cluster of issues. I expect to see name calling and all of that. But I also expect to see a really silent middle, right? An entire group of the population that has sort of been eroded and silenced and afraid. And I would love if those people could sort of keep articulating that really dull, neutral, moderate middle position, right? Until that became normalized.
How inspiring, Ian.
Right? Like, I don't believe like we should sort of arrive at the middle through the averages of extremes,
Yes.
right? Through like very liberal positions and very conservative positions. But people who say, like, I want a little bit of that and I want a little bit of this, and so my bandwidth isn't very wide. But in fact, I think a lot of us fall in that middle ground.
I think maybe I would describe what you're describing as that middle ground as the vital center. I'm thinking here of the term that the American historian Arthur Schlesinger used to use to describe liberal democracy, the idea of what does it mean to be a vital center? Liberal, you're a conservative, I'm left, but we kind of both agree that we don't have the full story, and we both kind of agree that this only works together, so we come in the middle, and we do something together here. And then we go back, but we know that there's this other side. We need, in a sense, both. So I would say that's one thing. The second I would point to is an article I read on CBC Online maybe about a year ago. Would have been a year ago. A maritime province, and it was an article about parents' rights protests over a parenting bill related to gender identity in, I think, Nova Scotia. And it was New Brunswick, thank you, it was New Brunswick. And the article was about recently arrived, I may also have this wrong, but recently arrived Syrian immigrants who were on the pro-parents' rights side of things, but also marched for Palestine. And it was the way that they were encountering online vitriolic anti-immigrant sentiment from the very people who had been welcoming these wonderful migrants from this Civil War-torn country to wonderful Canada. So it was a multicultural story, and then suddenly it was the backward immigrants. It was an excellent article because you couldn't collapse anyone into a singular political or ideological category. That struck me as an example of Canada working. You are not consolidated into being for Palestine and against parents' rights. You're capable of both. And as a society, we need to be capable of sustaining a space for people to be able to be both. That's how you sustain a vital center, I think. And I think those are the stakes for the kind of stuff we're doing here. We have to prepare people at a university to go out and reckon with that kind of internal difference because we ourselves are internally different. Could you imagine if you were just monochromatically your voting preference? What a banal way to describe who you are.
That's interesting. So you have to be prepared to accept that people do not certainly belong to one category. You can't have that.
Very much. Yeah.
Right. But then at the same time, there's this challenge of you trying to put people into categories, and the moment they don't meet one of your criteria to be in your circle, then you exclude them from your circle of friends or even colleagues. You just say hi and you don't want to interact with them. So then, essentially, what you're doing is stepping away from a civil discourse opportunity.
Yeah, I think our pattern recognition systems are kind of flawed right now, right? If someone meets like one box on parents Palestine, we expect them to meet a bunch of other points identically. So the rejection of one thing is this kind of like efficiency model and shorthand. It's just kind of crept in from business. It's in dating. It's just everywhere, right? Someone misses you on like one point, and then you throw everything away. Instead of seeing that, people are made up of multiple positions, right? There's a really sort of great moment when I was in grad school. It was like prof super like high on post-structuralism, right? Like there was no center and everything. We're just crossing, and you are just like the sum of multiple voices and all of that. But that gave people really kinds of like rich identities, right? That couldn't just be reduced to just kind of like a dance card. So, so I guess what I'm saying is don't always rely on the perceived pattern, right? Like take an individual, it's gonna take a lot more work all the time, right? To sort of like regard each individual and figure out, okay, where are they here and where they are here? And to let go too of this model where we are evaluating each other, right? Evaluating each other as if their worthiness to be in my circle means that they must match a bunch of criteria. People are already worthy to be in your circle. My brother, who I would never be friends with in like real life if he wasn't my brother, is like, a wonderful human being, right? He just got plopped into like my life. But this is it, like there's no selection process or worthiness, right? Let people come as they are into your life and occupy that space.
And I would just say, in full agreement with everything Ian said, apply the same logic to yourself. In other words, again, it goes back to that sense of erosion, of self-erosion. I'm not sure that I'm in agreement with A, B, C, D, and E, so maybe I shouldn't go to that event. Maybe I shouldn't go to that talk. Maybe I see these 4 people having a conversation. I'm not sure I'm with all of them, and I'm scared about what might happen. And so in that case, I'm not giving you the benefit of the doubt. I'm not risking anything myself. It's easier to just go home, turn on the phone, as if the phone's ever off. Go home, play with the phone, and keep on going. But so everything you've said is matched to what we do inside ourselves that prevents civil discourse.
Yeah, and the fear of being associated, too, with the wrong group, right? Yes. So, like, if I go there, then people will think X or Y about me. And so on one hand, we're super concerned about what other people think about us, right? Hence all the virtue signaling that's happening. And on the other hand, we don't care at all what some people think about us, right? And that's what enables us to attack people so like viciously. And that kind of contradiction really depends on a kind of binary model of viewing people, right? It's like, this person is safe and worthwhile, and therefore I care about what they think about me. This person is irrelevant and pointless and whatever, and so I can shame them, I can humiliate them, I can do whatever I want with them. there's a limit to that kind of thinking, and it will really just flatten out our relationships.
Lesson learned, don't jump into conclusions, don't put people into buckets, really be curious, going back to all those principles you're saying. Be okay with the discomfort of, not liking or agreeing with someone exactly the first time. Engage with them in further conversations. Now, the second part of today's panel is civil discourse and what it means for liberal democracy. So I'm just going to ask the same question that's on the title.
Sure.
How do you think they're two related? And if you can expand on that.
Well, I think what we're pointing to in part with this title is the formative role of the university in preparing people to go out and recognize and reckon with difference. I think that's one thing. And I think maybe core to that is to develop capacities at university for a kind of thinking that goes beyond confirmation or assessment. And this will all apply then in public life. I'll give you an example from what you were just saying. I don't do it really anymore, but at least once a year for many years, I would make a point of pitching a very conservative magazine with a crazy, crazy novel. I can remember 1Q84, the Murakami epic, tons of weird Japanese sexes in it, and I pitched National Review, very conservative magazine. Because for me, intellectually, to make a case for this novel to this audience is so much more exciting than writing about it for the Globe. Oh, this is gonna really be tough to make a case for why you should consider this novel to Globe readers, really, right? So intellectually, that stretches me. That makes it a little tougher. That came out of university life, I'm fairly certain. It came out of the conversations I was having, and it came out of coursework and study. This is in one discipline, obviously, in literature and related cultural work. But it seems to me like finding the ways to extend outward from however we are formed at university. And then I think, to kind of understand the relationship between your personhood and your capacity to be in relation to people in different ways. You know what I mean? Like I was just arguing with an editor about whether you can read books for different reasons, or does it all have to be capital L literature? No, we read for different reasons. We interact with people for different reasons. We can have this level, you and I can have this level of agreement, beyond which, probably not. And that's okay. I'll still make fun of you for running from Spadina Station either way. But I think it's being open to gradation, I think, and university prepares people for that. Civil discourse is that. And then that, I think, sustains a healthier shared public life.
Yeah, and so Randy's done a good job with the university part of it. I think the other part that really concerns me is where we're getting our information and our sources, right? So it's protecting those journalism and media sort of outlets, the places that we refer to, cite, trust, uphold. Those things signal, I think, societal values, right? So, we want everything for free, don't we? Right? You want your news for free, you want everything for free, but there are tried and true processes of vetting and fact checking and all of those things that are important to support. I think also paying attention to our media, our information, the quality of our information, insisting and demanding on good information. Right.
Right, I just wanted to check in with Carolyn, which I want to go into the Q&A because I'm pretty sure the audience also has questions. Joe, I'm pretty sure that you will bring the questions on the screen for us from online, and then I'll start with the audience here. So I'm just going to open it up to the audience, and I'll walk and give you. Yeah, absolutely.
Fascinating conversation. Utterly fascinating, utterly salient. But the question is, what I'm curious, because I spend a great deal of time abroad, and the more I know, the less I understand, which goes to the aspect of humility. To me, it's almost atavistic. But the big question is, Where do we go from here? There is so much astringency. Our society is becoming a great deal balkanized, exacerbated by the media, that people are relying on it as opposed to, say, reading literature or having informed discussions. And my concern with bestiality, did the animal give consent? Informed consent, speaking with a legal background. But nonetheless, a sense of humor is critical. Canada is not the place that I grew up in. I'm not saying it's better. I'm not saying it's worse. It's qualitatively different, which means that this conversation that we're having now is of ordinal impact. And for that, I say thank you.
I would point to the importance of a couple of things in response. One would be reading novels, and I say this alongside a fellow novelist, alongside fellow English professor. I think novels give you a variety of perspective, a variety of people in conflict and relation to each other in a way that no other art form does. I think movies make you too passive, but novels make you work to engage with different kinds of people. For you specifically, sir, I recommend Faulkner's Snopes trilogy, which involves an active romantic relationship between a farmer and a cow. But that's just for you. That will let you to keep exploring that particular question. Good. Oh, and then, sorry, just one other thing I would say would be, how do we recover something more? I would say it's multiple forms of affiliation. It seems to me that sometimes our celebration of diversity presumes graduate degrees. You know, diversity as long as we all happen to be in this room right now. The fact that I go to church every Sunday and then I go into a basement where I have coffee with people who come from different parts of the world, different socioeconomic and education levels, puts me in a different relation with them. The ushers that always kind of push me around when I go to sit down, these are people who, outside of church, are in a very different socio-political or socioeconomic place than I am, but there, in a good way, they have standing and authority. And I respond to them differently than when we're outside and I've got my weird glasses and they're off to an hourly job, let's say. I encounter different people. It doesn't have to be a religious affiliation, but multiple affiliations to differentiate and invite you to encounter people beyond people like us, is what I would say.
Yeah, I'll add just one thing. Leave your country, right? Leave the country behind. If you grew up in Canada and you've never left this country, or you grew up in America and you've never left America, it's time to go somewhere else in the world and spend a sustained amount of time. It will do wonders for your humility to realize that there are people elsewhere speaking 3-4 languages, right? It will do things like, oh, that's how they do it. Oh, the Japanese toilets are so great. Why don't we have these here, right? Why can't I push the elevator button in Korea, right? All of these things that people do, the street food, all of these things just that the rest of the world is living, and we think somehow because we're not seeing them on our screens that, you know, that kind of like life doesn't exist. But it's so important to get out of where you are. Actually, this would be like a dream, like if you wanted to start a university with me or something. You know, the third year of your program, you just have to be in another country studying abroad. The Germans do it really well, right? Sending their people everywhere. But like you just have to be elsewhere and bring back like that language requirement kind of thing, right? Struggle through making beautiful sentences in a foreign language, yeah.
Perfect. I was told by Carolyn that we are actually going to move to the second panel, then leave the questions to the end for time, yes. And so I want to appreciate you both. This has been great opportunity for me to learn. So thank you, and thank you to the audience for listening. So we're going to move to the next part of the event.
Thanks, everybody.
Hello? Yes, okay. So that was a slight detour in the program. We're going to have questions after the panel, but that question, I think, provoked a very interesting final for now, exchange between our two conversationalists. I am bristling with questions, but it will be family holdback. I will not intrude. I'm so glad that at the end the question of you both bring, or the interesting phenomenon that you are both novelists as well as professors of English and celebrated novelists at that, entered the conversation. I think the kind of sensitivity to dialogue that you both evinced is probably in part a tribute to your imaginations as novelists. Love to hear more about that. But let me now introduce my dear friend and colleague of long standing, with whom I have had many rich discussions on this topic and hope to have many more, Professor Paul Gooch. Paul is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at U of T and President Emeritus of Victoria University. But do not let the emeritus fool you. He is continuing to be deeply engaged in scholarship and teaching and in playing leading roles in academic governance. The Vic 1 program, with which most of you will be familiar, of first-year undergraduate seminars, includes a Gooch stream in philosophy and ethical citizenship, in which Paul offers a course on virtues and vices, in which I would love to be a fly on the wall. Don't know what vices he addresses, Randy, but you've got another idea now, Paul. He is immediate past chair of the Ontario University's Council on Quality Assurance and continuing advisor to university leaders across Canada. There could not be a better moderator for this panel, and I welcome Paul to introduce his co-panelists.
Satesh, why don't you come? Yes. Allison, Dale? Yeah, that's fine. But I would like you on my left so I can actually see you. And do not drink Randy's water. Oh, you've got it. Good, thank you. There we are. Well, thank you very much, Carolyn. And thank you, Ian and Randy, for your incredible conversation. I just want to start talking to you. But I've got a great panel here, and there we are. You've got... So I think this person is Alison Thompson. What are you doing here?
I've been asking myself that, yeah.
Been asking yourself? Yeah.
Oh, really? What am I doing here?
Yeah, really.
What
about you? Yes. What do you...
Well, I'm here because I've had a long-standing interest in this topic, and it's one of those threads that has run through my academic life here at the University of Toronto. I'm in the Faculty of Pharmacy, and I'm a bit of an oddball there. My background is in applied ethics and public health ethics, so I am not a pharmacist, but I do really think these issues are important for all university students, for civil society, but I'm here today mostly to talk about my experience teaching healthcare professionals and how this relates to parts of what we've already gone over. It relates or manifests in the healthcare education part of the university.
Okay, so we'll get to that in a minute, but Satesh, say something about yourself. I mean, you have a very interesting area of study, I think. Yeah.
This is working perfect. Yeah. So I'm a student in the same faculty that one of our professors is teaching. I'm a fourth-year pharmacy student, and at the same time, I'm working towards becoming a military pharmacist. I've joined the Canadian Armed Forces 2 years ago. And that's what I'm working towards, and currently I'm doing my rotations, and I'm doing an institutional rotation at one of the community hospitals in North York General.
I love this field and I love healthcare, and mainly I'm here because I want to offer reflections from their previous panel, and hopefully if it gets to healthcare conversations, and as a student, as a learner, I can bring in my lived experience.
Great, thank you. And Dale Turner.
Yes, hello, welcome. Thank you. And so my name is Dale Turner. My father is Temiagama Anishinaabe from Temagami First Nation, Northern Ontario, and my mother is from Devon, England. And so I'm a citizen of Canada, the United Kingdom, and the Temagami First Nation. And I also live part-time in the UK. My beloved lives in North Yorkshire, and so I just like to affirm the travel part my background is I was first worked as an engineer in the Navy, and then my community had a land claim case that went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and I got interested in that because I couldn't quite understand how our narratives, how our self-understandings of who we were as Anishinaabe people could be so distorted by the time they got through the legal process into the Supreme Court of Canada. And I got interested in that as a philosophical problem. And so I naively, I think, believed that I had no interest in becoming an academic. But I did end up studying philosophy at McGill with Charles Taylor and James Tully. And I gravitated towards Wittgenstein as a philosopher. That may mean something to some of you. So my thinking about this cross-cultural understanding through a kind of dialogical approach to the Cambridge School and so on, but weaving into that the wisdom sort of the Anishinaabe elders that I grew up around. So that's been my kind of intellectual, philosophical process, and I am also writing a novel. So,
Thank you, Dale, thank you. Well, listen, I think we have a great experience on this panel and discourses from different areas, so I want to get them talking to each other. So we'll do that for a little while, and then we're going to bring Ian and Randy back and have more general discussion, because this is important that we have discourse together. But I was interested, gentlemen, in your constant reference to the university, because that's what I've been thinking about, the way in which civil discourse happens or should happen on the university, because I think this is protected space. It's a different kind of space for discourse than the public space, where our speech is protected. And so I don't think it's just a matter of free expression on a university. I think what we do at the university is to have my expression meet your expression, and it's in the meeting of those expressions that teaching and learning takes place. So, the Charter protects blather anywhere, but we don't want blather on the University of Toronto. We want discourse that is intelligent and not just expression, but discourse as a conversation. So, Randy, I'd like very much the notion of a conversation together. In fact, I think of education as interrogative conversation, in which we ask each other's questions. So, panel, I'd like to know what, in your experience, you find as impediments to this proper kind of discourse that we should have in the university. What's going on? Who wants to start? Not you, okay. Right?
I'm happy to.
You're going to jump in,
kick
okay.
the ball here. I think this is something I have seen in the classroom. I would say it's a fairly recent phenomenon, and the first time it happened was in my graduate seminar on public health ethics, and I had a guest lecturer. Actually, it's not a lecture style course, so he was a guest instructor who was sharing his experience working in global health ethics. and this person is an older white man, happens to be not from Canada, but committed his whole life to fighting oppression, and his backstory might not have been readily available to the students in the seminar. And he said a couple of things which students did not generously interpret. And then he shared with us that he had come with a case study which was asking students to use their moral imaginations, to imagine themselves in the shoes of a Black South African woman who was being asked to participate in a clinical trial for an HIV medication. And he shared with us that he can no longer use that case study in South Africa, where he's from, because he has been told that that is actually unethical to have written this case study himself, where he was exercising moral imagination. So we actually had a kind of an interesting conversation about that. But the fact that he felt extremely uncomfortable about using this case study, which we used actually many, many times over the years in that class, but he was actually terrified to have us use that case study. And so it ended up being an interesting conversation, but there was this offense taken by some remarks that he made. And I started thinking, there's something wrong if he can't do this, if he can't invite us through the use of his own moral imagination to engage our moral imaginations. And of course, there's a reason for that. There are limits to what you can do with your moral imagination. You can, as Thomas Nagel says, you can imagine what it's like to be a bat, but you'll never actually know what it's like to be a bat, right? You don't have sonar. You don't sleep upside down, I hope. So there are limits to moral imagination, and it's very important to acknowledge what those are and to not claim to speak for people's lived experience if you don't have it yourself. So that's an important point to raise, but it made me very concerned about ethics education in general, and frankly, the whole point of reading literature really is to engage your moral imagination, and that's the beauty of it. That is why it is so important for people to be reading novels. And so I'll just share one more anecdote. I was teaching first-year pharmacy students recently, and a student asked a question around conscientious objection. And the question was, could a pharmacist refuse to dispense a sex hormone to a transgender patient if they felt like they wanted, if it was morally objectionable to them? And I was surprised by my own reaction, which was terror. I didn't know what to say. They took me off guard. And so that gave me pause. Luckily, I had the luxury of being able to say, I'm going to go look that up and I'll get back to you. Talked to some colleagues who were absolutely horrified that this question had been asked, and said, a lot of them were like, oh, they're asking for a friend, and that this wasn't a genuine question. And that is a problem too. It is a legitimate question. The student called me, or I had an email from a student 2 weeks later saying that she hadn't been able to sleep, she was afraid to come to class, and she was worried that she had harmed people in the class. And so those two stories, I think, kind of for me, are really speak to what we're facing at the university and why it's so important to be able to engage with moral imagination. It's an essential part of health professions education because it's about listening to people's stories and imagining yourself in their shoes, which is a really important part of being a healthcare provider, but it's also important for all of us, and it's not just unique to the health professions.
Okay, so you'll be recommending Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead to
Yes.
To your class,
it's
right?
a quick
For your
read.
pharmacy?
Yeah.
Did this spark anything? Are you sparking there, Dale, or?
I'm not quite sure how to. I'm not quite sure how to bring a kind of indigenous perspective into to sort of follow from what you're saying. But let me build a little bit on from what I've heard before, in particular the role of the university. And I think over the course of several decades, what started off as a belief that studying philosophy, in particular political philosophy, that to understand the court, all I needed to do was to understand, for example, the kind of history of ideas, in particular, say, social contract theorists, people like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, in particular Locke, whose view on property is very important because it has influenced the way we understand contemporary notions of property and law. And so I spent time trying to unpack this, to try to understand Locke in and on his own terms. And what I've realized is that I've gravitated towards this fundamental question, which is how do we understand indigenous peoples in and on their own terms? And what I see that has happened is we, especially my generation of indigenous academics, have been so focused on the legal and political discourses of the state and trying to empower ourselves within those ways of reasoning and styles of reasoning. There are a whole generation, both in Canada and the US, of indigenous lawyers, right, who believe that the answers to understanding indigenous ways of being could be accommodated in the courts of law. And I think, my own opinion, is that has failed. That Section 35 can only go so far in capturing indigenous ways of knowing and being in the context of a legal and political relationship that purports to recognize the integrity of indigenous nationhood. So where does that leave me? So the way that I think into this, and I think the university should be a place where indigenous peoples can come to unpack some of these hard problems of understanding how our relationships to land and indigenous ways of being are listened to and respected in a place like in a university. So one way of thinking about this is to think about, for a lot of indigenous peoples, and the concept that I've been thinking through is this idea of indigenous presence. What is the indigenous presence at the university? And the thing is that with a lot of indigenous students, we have indigenous students, we have indigenous faculty, and we have indigenous staff here at the University of Toronto. But there's a very complex relationship that goes back to their communities. And their relationships with communities is key and important to the way that they participate in the learning process. And to turn that on its head, that's what a land acknowledgement is supposed to recognize and respect, which is not simply that we respect and we acknowledge indigenous homelands, the indigenous presence, but that what goes along with this, and here's where it starts to get difficult, I think, is a term that a lot of indigenous peoples would say is that we are trying to find room to make sense and to have indigenous spirituality respected within the institution. That those connections that go back to our communities through people who work in various capacities within the institution go beyond the institution, right? They go back to our homelands, they go back to our traditional languages, and they go back to the people in our communities. So there's a very complex relationship that I think indigenous peoples think of as a spiritual relationship. Perhaps philosophy, we would use a word like ontology, right? As an uncomfortable fighting word for a lot of philosophers. But this, so what I'm getting at is that indigenous ways of understanding and being are really what are at stake in attending an institution such as a university. And I think that degree of comfort to be able to talk in their own voices has not been a welcomed part of everyday life for in particular, Indigenous students. So a lot of these principles of generosity, the conditions of an ideal speech situation, all of these kinds of philosophical ways of understanding cross-cultural meaning are not embedded in the everydayness of the Indigenous peoples that come to an institution like this. So on one hand, we have all of this sort of theory that we can allude to that they could participate and learn to be able to broaden their language. And I think this is key, that in learning, we learn to use other language. So I'm a Wittgensteinian, so I'm going to put it in Wittgensteinian terms. We participate in language games and forms of life that are not what we are most comfortable with. And it seems that Indigenous peoples that their forms of life, their forms of difference that they bring to the institution have not been welcomed. They have been, it still remains a hostile sort of environment for a lot of students. But that's a different issue. So sorry.
Well, thank you. I mean, we need to hear this. And we need to ask whether there's something that should happen as a result of this in our classrooms when I have an Indigenous student, for instance. But I'm going to let Satya speak whatever you say, and then let's see if we can find anything that we can talk about in common. Yeah.
I do find a common thread between what you both said, essentially, you know, conversation, and I think you said that partly, if I understood, the way we interact is affected by our identity. And one point that you brought up was really interesting to me is the presence of Indigenous peoples in our campus. And frankly, I can tell you that our faculty does a great job of promoting that and for us to create opportunities to exercise our moral imagination as it comes to different communities, people from different backgrounds. But the limitation of that is, like, if that person from that background is not sitting there, it's hard, because I think as someone who was born in Iran, then immigrated here, I have my own biases, being exposed to a certain religion, ways of living, and then here. So how much can I exercise my moral imagination, and what are the limitations of that? I think that's the tough part as a learner, but I think it's a great opportunity. And I think when it comes to even understanding the perspectives and ways of being and living of the Indigenous communities, for me, it would be great to have that opportunity on campus to engage with them in civil discourse. So then I can sit in front of them. It's not just about reading or being presented slides about the communities. It's actually having somebody from that community coming and talking to me about it. And even the first question you said, I think things like that come up, and I can frankly tell you that it's fearful as a student to ask that questions, because the moment you ask the question, people jump into conclusions or have assumptions about your beliefs. So simply just being curious on our campus is scary nowadays, because people make assumptions about what your beliefs are, or what you associate with. So I would actually not do that, because I feel like that wouldn't be smart as a student nowadays on our campus. So that's what I said, the challenge when I brought up in our first conversation, is that's the challenge that I feel, is there's conclusions made about you just based on a simple question and being curious. So that's, that's our challenge on our campus. So how do we go about that? How do we navigate that?
Very good question. Let me just reflect on my own experience, because I think good discourse requires trust. I don't think we've used the word trust yet, but it's been implicit in what we've been saying, that if I don't trust you, I'm not going to open myself up and tell you what I think. So we also need, in addition to epistemic humility, we need epistemic charity, and I think that's what you were getting at as well, that you're willing to accept what the other person's saying, to ask further questions. You, Dale, in your interaction with Randy, showed epistemic charity, I think, in that way. But when you have a large lecture theater you don't know who your students are. I mean, you see them out there. Just imagine like 10 times this number somewhere, and how could I begin to know? And how could you begin to trust me or I trust you? So in our educational system, I think we need to be present more to each other. And I'm thinking of a time in which one of my students was going on in Virtue and Vice, we were talking about food and eating and the vices and virtues of eating, and she was saying how, according to Peter Singer and others, vegetarianism was an absolute imperative. You had to be a vegetarian. And then further down the table, one of my students put up his hand and he said, actually, I'm indigenous. And we have the dish with one spoon and we eat the whole animal. And his presence in that room changed the conversation. It wasn't just something that they were reading about, just not seeing something on a screen. It was this human being sitting just 3 people away from you that you had to stop and think, well, maybe that's not the whole story. But how do you scale that up in a big university like this so that our discourse is actually among people instead of numbers or faces on screens?
I was just on a panel with Peter Singer in Wales, and this issue came up.
Yeah?
Interestingly enough, a little bit. And, but it raises a point of the forms of difference that are at stake for Indigenous peoples in where, for example, I think when you think about, and I would flag this as a problem with liberalism, it focuses, and the commitment to moral individualism focuses on the individual person as the locus of rights, right? That they're the rights are held by individuals. That's how the language of rights works. People like Will Kimlicka come along and say, we can actually recognize a group right, but it still has to be ultimately grounded in recognizing the sanctity of individual rights. So that is a sort of fundamental ontology that builds an account of justice itself. Well, in a lot of indigenous worldviews, the ones I'm familiar with, there's a kind of equality across beings. So living and non-living things carry the same ontological status. So there's a kind of built-in view of equality. And with regards to so what that means then is we get a different account of justice, right? If we're going to build that up from that sort of way, fundamental difference, right? And then you bring in indigenous languages that function differently. It's a real mess. And since I feel like we're on the Joan Rivers panel here, right? Like, can we talk? Clearly, that's an old joke. Nobody. But what's related to this, back to this point about hunting, which is someone told a story once about how they were going to shoot a deer, and as they were going to shoot the deer, a big buck came in line of fire and turned and looked at the rifle, and the hunter interpreted that to mean, don't shoot that deer, take me, right? And in other words, there's a relationship between the deer and the hunter. So and then of course when the deer is used, the whole deer is used in the community and so on. So it fits in to a worldview that where that deer is a fundamental part of their spiritual relationship to the world, right? John Locke says, in fact, he says this, when a hunter shoots a deer from the state of nature, it becomes his property. Well, in an indigenous worldview, when they shoot that deer, it belongs to the community. Why? Because that's their job in the community, to provide food for everyone. So you're getting off the ground in a different way. And I think that creates forms of difference that when they come to an institution such as this one, there are fields of study that aren't just don't think about the world this way, but they're hostile to it. But things are changing. So I don't want to paint a miserable picture about this, but in fact, I'd like to come back and build on some of what you were saying about this, the role that the university can play, in particular, how we bring our young people together from these various backgrounds to create a context, to create a spirit of goodwill.
Right,
You know?
right. Thank you, Dale. There may be some other issues that you'd like to bring up, because we've got just a few minutes before we're going to open it up. So did you want to come and say anything else? Are you hoping that I'm going to ask you a question?
I just wanted to talk a little bit about, and you have touched on it earlier in the panel, a little bit about this concept that Iris Murdoch has of unselfing, which is part of moral imagination as well. And that is, sort of putting aside your own perspectives, biases, beliefs, opinions, so that you really can imagine yourself into another person's perspective. And I think that's something that I think the younger generations are having a hard time with. It's hard. I have only anecdotal evidence of this. I have a colleague in medicine who talks about the narcissistic way that medical students read texts. They look for themselves in the text rather than stepping outside of themselves and saying, what is this person actually trying to say? They may not be saying it very well, but what are they trying to say? That's that epistemic humility or charity that we're looking for. But it's also, the kinds of problems that they're drawn to in research. My colleague calls it me-search. So there's this sense that higher education is about you and what you can get out of it, and it's probably related partly to the fear of using moral imagination, but I think there's a bigger issue about the neoliberal university and the student mentality of consumer of education, credentialism, rather than really going there to have the top of your head blown off, or if you come out the other side unscathed, that's totally fine. So I think I'm not saying everybody is like that, but I do think that there's students are having a harder time decentering themselves when they're engaging with other people and with texts, and I see that as part of this problem of moral imagination as well, since it's an essential component for that. And I think, again, we've talked a little bit about what the solution to that is, and it's travel, it's rubbing shoulders with people you don't normally meet or socialize with.
Thank you. Satish, are there other things you want to jump into on this?
Just wanted to kind of connect the 2 points, actually. So I think it's very useful. You brought up the point about how the Indigenous community sees equality. I think it can be really useful and applied to civil discourse, because if I'm open and apply the principles of civil discourse, I think it's important to have that view of we're all equal, and that actually opens up your mind to any conversation, really. And that is partly the humility. And I think, I think you used the term, what was it, unselfing? What was that?
Yeah, unselfing.
Unselfing. Yeah. And I think unselfing partly goes to just, in essence, your understanding of humanity. You could try to imagine, even if it's hard, because in essence, all of us are humans, but it takes more effort. That's from me.
Good, thank you. Well, I know we want to give you lots of time for questions and comments, so I'm going to ask Ian and Randy to sit over there so that they can also take place. But as you come, let me reflect on this. Going to come over here. Join me, Ian. Thank you. Let me reflect on this, that students, in the 60s used to claim that they wanted their freedom, didn't want the university to treat them like children, and then over the last decades, students have not only asked, please be my parent, it's please be my uncle, my aunt, my counselor. So students have, the university has turned to students to make them feel good and comfortable. Now, Northrop Frye used to say, student satisfaction, you're not here to be satisfied, we're here to make you unsatisfied. Who is satisfied with the way the world is? So, now, but recently, we have seen a social justice in the university's mandates, and we have seen students who are protesting. So, in a way, this is not a bad thing at all. So I want to ask you guys, what's the role of protest in civil discourse in the university?
I guess this one's me. Okay. I think there's absolutely, irreducibly a place for protest in the life of the university. I think that to try to apply the logic of civil discourse to every single activity at a university necessarily neutralizes the concept of civil discourse itself, and then just turns everything into a vague set of best practices for difficult conversations. Gross. So we have to acknowledge that there are some times where we think out loud together. There's some times where we want to march. Are there some times where we want to camp? That, I think, in the past few months, is a much more controverted question. But how do we understand the role of protest? First, by beginning with an acknowledgement that protest is valid, protest is natural to the life of a university. I think this goes all the way back to the Middle Ages and theology students fighting in the streets of Paris over their respective instructors. 18, 19, 20, fired up, your head blown off by an idea, and then seeing something wrong in the world that makes you dissatisfied. Well, I don't think you necessarily want to sit down and think out loud together and, well, what would Rawls make of this? I don't think so. I think there's a context for that, but it's finding spaces and the right way to protest. Now, the right way to protest, that's a very different question that I don't have a singular answer to, but it's something that I think we will continue to talk about at this university.
Yeah, we know the wrong way, but.
Yeah, I think protest is under the umbrella of like, how do we make changes happen, right? And protest is one way to sort of like affect change in the world. Conversations are another way. The legal route is another way. Traditional forms of knowledge, all these have their place and their time and need to be deployed well. But the university is also a good place to teach people how to protest and to really, it's really beautiful, like at that age in your sort of early 20s where you've got this activist spirit and you actually believe the world can be changed just by throwing yourself at it, right? And just by like force of effort and will. And eventually we hurt ourselves doing that, right? And we stop doing it. And I don't think I want to discourage students from doing it, right? At this age, they've got the muscular strength to do it at this age. But to realize that that's not the only way to sort of affect change, right? You protest, and then what is your strategy, right, beyond that?
Thank you. Well, I think it's time to have some questions from the audience, and I don't know how we're going to decide. So just stand up and yell. Oh, sorry.
We need this microphone so you can be heard online and on the recording. Sorry.
You want civil discourse, right? Okay.
Just
yes.
so the
All right.
recording can pick it up.
All right.
So
Thank you.
Thank you. I am fired up, excited, and quite amused at how this discussion is going, especially that you're talking about civil discourse. My name is Wanja. I'm a journalist and a Massey Fellow. So I should also own up that I have a bias for human rights and social justice. So everything you spoke about hits home. But while listening to these conversations, I am challenged to actually look at discussions beyond the normal. Because as a journalist, I'm constantly finding myself these days walking a tightrope. As in, what should I say? How should I say it? Where should I say it? If you look at social discussions online, on Twitter, who will judge me for what I am saying? So I hear that when you say that there's a fear of being judged, that in consequence tends to force people to censor themselves. You're like, oh, I want to be very careful about what I want to say because I don't know how I'm going to be judged. And that is affecting genuine conversations, and it is almost creating what I would call a shrinking democratic space where people cannot actually say what they think because they fear that they'll be criticized. So now, as an alumni of Massey College, I spent a year at the U of T. I love the university. I think it's a great place for growth, but I have also spent time in other universities. I am from Kenya. I have lived Southern Africa. I've lived here. I've lived elsewhere. So when it comes to exposure, I think I've seen quite a few things. But I have, it's an observation I have made. I don't think this is a question. It is almost as if there is a very deliberate practice to thought policing at the universities, institutions of learning, so much so that it is palpable for the students, it's palpable for those that interact, even those that teach, the professors. You can feel it when, yesterday I walked past the square at St. George campus where there was a protest camp. And I saw that the camp has been removed, grass has grown, students are there and they're happy. And I thought, yeah, the grass will grow. But the issues for which students are trying to protest, as you put it, things that they're trying to talk about, and they're talking about the shrinking democratic space, still persist. And then here we are, sitting in a room full of scholars, students, learners, talking about these things. And yet, the veil of what we can say and cannot say in this space persists. So the challenge is, how do we open up these spaces so we can have genuine, open conversations without judgment? And I think that is what everyone here is trying to say. I think I would love to sit in your class. I like the way you think. You're causing everybody to get uncomfortable because that is where growth happens. So yeah, my challenge and my observation would be civil discourse can only happen where people are allowed to be authentically who they are, where they can say what they think, how they see it, and how they want to say it, use the right word they think they should use without the fear of judgment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments that you, yes.
Paul, sorry, do you want to take a few questions
Yes.
and then people can sort of answer collectively?
Yeah, let's take some questions.
Okay.
So if you have questions,
Okay.
back
Okay. Yep.
there. Yeah.
One right here.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Cheyenne. So I love talking about conflict. And so the ideas that you were talking about around thinking out loud and engaging in that space, I find fascinating. Right now, I'm doing research with finding out what the conflict experience of healthcare students is and how it's impacting their development as professionals. And as I'm right now engaging and talking with these students and finding out what they've experienced on their rotations at the faculty, what I'm finding is a lot of students are describing power imbalances and how those are not allowing them to show up as their genuine selves in those situations, how it's affecting how they're able to engage, how they're able to voice their thoughts. Even the perception of a power imbalance is impacting how they can come to those conversations. So the question I had today was, how do you think power imbalances impact civil discourse? And is it the responsibility of the person in power to be aware of that and to also find a way to allow that conversation to happen more freely?
Well, I'm the chair of this panel, so I will. Yes.
Do we want to take one more for the group and then?
All right. Hello. My name is Tushar. I'm a third-year medical student, and I'm also a junior fellow here. So thank you, everyone, for all of your amazing insights. My question, I think there was someone who said in the first half that we have to come to terms with the fact that people have multiple positions on multiple topics. And my argument is that a lot of people have already come to terms with this, but it's that our political systems and our media landscape are not set up, and they're not designed to handle this and to move forward with this type of change. So not to sound cynical, but what is the role of civil discourse and being in this room and having a discussion if nothing politically or in a systems level can change the way things are right now?
Okay, there's another question. Let's get a few more questions and we'll
keep it going. Okay. Can I just get hands of everybody who...
I just wanted to add that part of the problem that we're not addressing, unfortunately, and this puts a lot of pressure on the university, is that this problem exists in all parts of society, okay? I'm a longtime book publisher and editor, 50 years in the Canadian business, and I have never seen such reticence in editorial departments in New York, London, and Toronto. I mean, this is a serious problem. The intellectual life of our country is under siege. And so I just wanted to say that the elephant in the room is society at large that is suffering from this being stuck and not able to speak to each other. So the university, of course, and I appreciate very much what you, Dale, said, because I think we need to learn a great deal from Indigenous culture, and I think that's one of the ways we're going to get out of this. We are facing the culture of corporatism, all right? And all the kids that you're getting into the university have already been brainwashed by the social media and the corporatism that basically wants to turn everybody into a non-thinking consumer. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay. Right. So some more questions for our panel.
Okay, Barbara.
Hi, my name is Barbara, and this has been an amazing panel and set of discussions. We're talking about civil discourse, about difficult subjects, and I wanted to ask, where do those pesky emotions fit in? Because the more we care about something, the more we're apt to feel, and that can inhibit or be an accelerant to civil discourse.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got power, politics, and passion. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, we'll just take two more, and then
I'll come to you.
We need to wrap up in a bit. So,
kia ora. My name is Aroha Harris, and I'm a visiting Indigenous Fellow at the Jackman Humanities Institute, and I'm staying here at Massey. And I have a question. I guess it's about, there's a lot of, I guess, aspiration in what I've heard of a place to get to in terms of space to have these discussions that we're talking about. And I guess my question is along the lines of what tools can we employ, or what tools do we already have for when we get it wrong? So if we attempt an honest discussion and we get it wrong and we ruin a relationship, we walk away, you know, whatever happens, we don't want to talk to that person anymore. But I believe strongly that Indigenous cultures in particular have practices and values to help us with that, and it's based on relationship, and this has come through in the conversation tonight, and it's constantly getting back to, oh, this has got off track, how do we get our relationship back in balance? And it's not just relationships human to human, it's human to non-human, human to the environment, and not just individual to individual either. It's just not, you know, mum and daughter having a falling out. It's actually how as groups, and I'd be interested to hear, because to me I'm not knocking the aspiration of having these good conversations and relationships all the time, but we cannot get them 100% right all the time, and what are the tools to rebalance when we need to do that? Kia ora.
thank you. Okay.
Oh, there's one more.
There's one more.
One more. Great.
Hi. I'm Lauren. I'm 35. I'm disturbed really by the suggestion that protest is only something for people in their 20s and that we grow out of it. I mean that quite seriously. I would like to talk more about protest and how it's understood as part of civil discourse. And protest is a way of having conversation when other conversations fail. And I'm concerned about the ways that protest is being reckoned with on the university level and understood as something that can't be too loud or can't exist outside of a bulletin board. I would really like to hear the panel's views on that.
Okay.
That's absolutely fair. I'll say that. I was just sort of concerned with like protests on campus and our student population generally. But you're right, protest persists beyond the university. I think it looks a little bit different, right? The protests that I might stage on my job, right? When I disagree with something, will not be a sit-in or something like that, right? The protest will take a different form. It could take an economic form. It could take withdrawing my resources and whatnot. I'm just trying to alert us to the multiplicities of ways of protesting. But you're still thinking something. I can see it.
Well, think out loud together, both of you.
Kind of a pernicious stereotype, I think, that protesters who march in the streets are naive.
Yeah, it's exactly what I'm trying to not trying to say. I'm saying like there are multiple forms of protest, and that's one form that's very recognizable. And a lot of other kinds of protests gets just kind of reduced to that. But there are multiple ways of sort of affecting change in protest.
But Ian, I think our interlocutors want you to reckon with the irreducible significance of that form of protest. What is the legitimacy and the role of that in our shared public life?
And not just on campus.
Yeah, like anywhere in Toronto, in the world, yeah.
Absolutely needs to exist, because this is the way. Sometimes agitation has to be quite unsettling, right? It can't be this kind of
androgynous.
No, that's not the word. You have to agitate it in a way that gets attention publicly. You could protest might not be the first step, and it might not be the last in a strategy of negotiations, right? What's that?
Advocacy.
Advocacy, yeah, but I do think that there is a time to really agitate, right? To really get under the skin of people and protest. That form of protest that we're both talking about is the best way to get attention, yeah. I don't think it's the only way. I think it's part of a strategy.
And is that how you deal with power, to come back to that?
No. Yeah, I don't think we're going to satisfy it right now, right? But maybe afterwards.
I think we need to be honest about power. I'm the professor. These are the students. I think there's nothing more obnoxious than pretending that I don't have power out of some false sense of equal perspective. That seems to me more humiliating than acknowledging, here's the power I have. What does it mean for me to use it responsibly in this context? That seems to me a kind of an honest reckoning with how power works in the university.
Conscious realization of power.
Say again?
Conscious realization.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. I think we're running out of time, but I will give one last sentence to each of the panel members if you want to take it. And if you don't want to take it, I'll give somebody else two.
So one, here's what I think U of T is capable of doing, is from an Indigenous perspective, is this institution has resources, and they should use the resources. For example, I'm a professor, but I can't, it's not my place within Anishinaabe culture to talk about traditional knowledge, but I know people who can. and somehow we need to get our students to them and to the land. So one aspect that I think is important is pedagogy. And one suggestion, or one thing that I'm doing in my courses, for example, is, well, one, I'm offering a course on Nadaki Manan, which is our homelands on Lake Temagami. Students get to go, and they get to look at the various sacred places on our lands while spending a week learning about the court case, but also what those relationships to the land mean. Another thing that I've started to do, even in large classes, is a question that I ask them is, what matters most to you and why? Is the first part of the question. The second part is, how has learning more about Indigenous issues affected what matters most to you? So it puts the student at the center and their own, what's important to them, and perhaps they'll never have another opportunity to study Indigenous issues again, or maybe it'll change and affect what matters most to them. So there are ways that I think we can get the students to learn from the appropriate teachers, Indigenous teachers, and we need resources to do that. So that's one small step that I think students should be learning from the appropriate teachers, is what I'm saying.
Perfect. So I've been taking notes from the question. I think I do want to provide, just a recap of what I learned from the audience as well as they're shared. I really very much agree with you that our campus is every day, like the democratic space that we said, it's shrinking. And even in this space, I can feel it very much, where it's like a politically correct way to say things. And that's my fear, one day somebody saying you said the wrong thing. So a lot of times I find myself just to be quiet and be an observer or a listener. And to be honest, I don't know what can we do to change that environment, because it's key to civil discourse. But I think professors can have a great role in creating space in classroom for people to have civil discourse and conversations. Otherwise, we won't learn. And back to your point, Barbara, there's going to be conversations where people's emotions are going to be very heightened, because we're such a diverse community that all of us have different backgrounds. And I think if you go into a homogeneous community, like where I come from, where most people belong to, we all have the same identity, it's very easy to think the same way. But when I look at my classmates, everybody is coming from a different country, different religions, and all of us practice different things in our family culture. So it's really hard. So I'm going to take to heart what you said, the principles of civil discourse, being open-minded, having that freedom of expression, and also as somebody who's going to be on the receiving end, just be open-minded and be okay with the discomfort of some of these conversations. And to my friend Tushar's there, I think you're right, because as learners, what we learn in our education system is that acknowledge that differences exist, and we acknowledge it, but then a lot of the times that's to the extent that we go to. And we end the conversation that we say, oh, I understand where you're coming from, but then that's where the conversation ends, because we just don't want to engage anymore. So that has to change, because we can't continue learning from each other because we don't want to engage and associate. And then I would be curious about the tools that we can use, because somebody brought that up. I don't know who said it, but the individual sitting at the back, because that's a good question. You're right, because there's all this aspirations for us to engage in civil discourse, but then what are the tools, and how can we rebuild relationships if they're ruined? Yeah, but those are the comments I wanted to offer. It's mainly reflections.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anything you want to say, Alison?
I'll just finish by saying, though, because I'm an ethicist and that's my hammer, I think it's interesting to think about what virtues we need. We've talked about epistemic humility, the principle of charity, but I think there's a responsibility there as well. And as Paul has argued, we should be talking about responsible discourse in the university, because it isn't free speech. It's not anything goes, as you know, and for health professionals as well, as Jordan Peterson just found out, our comrade, you know. So I do think that there's a responsibility there to be vigilant about where people are being silenced, to be vigilant about when you're censoring yourself, and to be courageous, you know, that I've had experiences of speaking out about issues that have had me labeled as an anti-vaxxer and being uninvited to give rounds at Public Health Ontario, things like that. There's a cost to you as a member of the university. You know, it hurt my career. You know, maybe we need better metrics. Maybe we need to value different things when we're looking at an Indigenous research proposal. You know, the time that's invested in building relationships doesn't count. There's no way to measure it, so it's not valued. And so there's lots of ways that we can all, even outside of the university, remain vigilant and be courageous. And I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other virtues that we need to sort of instill in our students and think about what they look like in ourselves.
Thank you. Now, Ian, you're going to be talking about this across the country, but you could have another sentence here if you... No? Thank you. Well, this is an example right here at Massey College of civil discourse about discourse. And this is the kind of place where we can come from our very different languages. We all speak different languages in our disciplines, to talk about this one thing that we have in common, and that's how is it that we can look for the truth of things together. That's what the university is about, and we need to keep talking about it. So thank you, Carolyn, for sparking this. Indeed.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thanks to all of our conversationalists and our panelists, and our audience on terrific questions from you. It really has been a model, and certainly I had very high expectations for this session. This has exceeded them. I am coming away, I know, with my mind much expanded, bristling with ideas that I want to continue to wrestle with. I'm just going to highlight three, and following Paul's example, they're all going to start with P. So I want to start with protest, and the idea that, and this, thank you, Randy, I actually hadn't crystallized the thought that not every event in the university needs to satisfy the conditions of civil discourse, that we need to think about a totality of exchange within the university. But we do need to provide venues that bring us together from our different protest pods if we are truly, I think, to serve the mission of the university. Not every event has to follow that pattern, but we need to be, and this goes to the second P, presence. We need to be in each other's presence, and probably physically present, probably looking at each other in the eyes. And there have been forests felled and gallons of ink spilled on the question of whether the virtual mediation of our relationships is getting in the way of that kind of physically present exchange. And I don't have a real segue to the third P, but it's power. And I'm a political scientist. I could not address power. But I would just note that power, at least in a liberal democracy, exists in an institutional context. And what we are talking about is discourse that constitutes the appropriate institutional context for the inevitable exercise of power, holding power accountable, making sure that those with more power than others, all the way down a hierarchical, sort of hierarchical structure, are aware of each other's presence and positions and take them seriously and mutually respect each other. That is what we are seeking with civil discourse, and I am really grateful to everyone who has contributed so brilliantly to this conversation today. And as I say, I know I am taking away so much myself, and I hope you are as well. Let me ask you to join us outside in the quad for some refreshments, and along the way to stop by the booksellers and should you be so moved, purchase a copy of Ian's book. I know I am about to do that. So.
My novels are available online.
Thank you very much to you all. I'm sorry. I've got one more task, which is to turn over the microphone to Stacy Laforme.
It's her fault. She invited me. I was really appreciate the conversation and the question at the back. When you were talking, I was sitting here listening, and I heard the courage that needs to be for spaces. I heard humility that has to be a part of it. I heard respect in the relationships. And what I realized you'd done is name 3 or 4 of the 7 grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe people. And I was thinking about some of the problems with the foundations and organizations, institutions, are because we don't have strong principles and philosophies on ways of being, like we carry the Anishinaabe teachings as our ways of being. And I was struck by how institutions could benefit. You know, I'm not saying it has to be our ways of doing, but with common threads of respect and humility and love throughout, I think that would be beneficial to any institution. And it's funny to me when the lady at the back, and I'm sorry I didn't catch her name, was talking about the indigenous ways of being, that so many people talk about reconciliation, so many people talk about indigenous ways of knowing to help us with climate change. And yet to do all that, you have to better understand us and better understand the systems that we use. And I do think that those systems, you know, built on a solid foundation could be very beneficial. So, miigwech, and that's all I had to say.